Good evening. Welcome to St. Peter's Hove, where the boiler has just been repaired and just in time too for the coldest day of the year. And it's our 97th or 8th step through the Bible on our walking tour, and we come to chapter 13 of the second book of Samuel, a horrible story. Now, the prophet Nathan has said the sword will never be absent from your house, and this prophecy now plays out in the domestic setting of King David's court and in King David's extended family. What happens is that Amnon, his eldest son, rapes Tamar, his half-sister, and then Absalom, Tamar's full brother, kills Amnon, his half-brother, in revenge 2 years later. Now, we know, or at least I think I know, as a student of literature, that this account was written by somebody who was very close to the events, both in time and geographically. They were probably in the palace in some capacity. Maybe they were a relation, maybe they were one of the retainers. And they were writing about these events 10, 20 years after they happened, when it was safe possibly to write about the events, when King David was safely dead, maybe. And they're writing anonymously because, of course, writing about the great ones of this earth is a dangerous occupation when they get the wrong end of the stick and they're not grateful to you for writing about them. How do we know that this is, in fact, a contemporary eyewitness account? Well, chapter 13, verse 19 has the following. After Tamar is raped, the poor girl is deeply distressed. She's distraught. It says, Tamar put dust on her head, tore the magnificent dress which she was wearing, laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. Now, what is this magnificent dress that she's wearing? It's clearly some sort of technical term. And it's a technical term that the editor of the account wants to explain to the reader because he doesn't think the reader will understand what this magnificent dress was. Earlier he said, she was wearing a magnificent dress, for this was what the king's unmarried daughters wore in days gone by. In other words, back in the day, the unmarried daughters of the king dressed in a certain way, and they dressed in a way that was reserved specially to them, just like in China, only the emperor could wear yellow, for example. Now, generally speaking, when you want to explain a fashion that's gone out of fashion, if I were to write something saying he was wearing a top hat, I wouldn't have to explain that, would I? You all know what a top hat is. But if I was to say he was wearing doublet and hose, I would have to explain what doublet and hose was, because nobody knows what doublet and hose are these days. That's what they wore in the time of the first Elizabeth, doublet and hose. So the person who put this into the second book of Samuel is writing about fashions that have been completely forgotten. And the custom of the king's unmarried daughters wearing certain things is completely needs explanation. So maybe this is 200-300 years after the event that it was edited. So in other words, the editor is drawing upon an archaic source by his standards, one that goes right back to the time when it was written. Please remember, Shakespeare never says, in came so-and-so wearing his doublet and hose, and he never has to explain that, because doublet and hose is what people wore in those days and what Shakespeare's contemporaries knew about. Okay, so I'm glad I've cleared up that one for you. The person who's writing this knows the characters intimately. The person who's writing this, although they don't say so, knows that Amnon is a problem. He is the eldest son, so there's a possibility, at the very least, he's going to inherit the throne, although in those days there's no set order of inheritance. Any of the king's sons can inherit the throne. Amnon is the eldest, therefore he's got a good claim, not necessarily the best claim, but he's certainly got a good claim. But Amnon is not really the sort of person you'd want as king. First of all, he cannot control himself. Now, he forms an attachment, a lust for his half-sister. Now, this for us is shocking, but please remember, in those days, a half-sister was not really a full sister, well, obviously not a full sister in blood, but not a sister in the modern sense. He wouldn't have been brought up with her. She was a close relative, but he wouldn't have known her particularly well. They would not have been brought up in the same household, because Amnon would have lived with his mother, And Tamar and Absalom would have lived with their mother. Though they had the same father, they didn't live together. Just as nowadays the king of Saudi Arabia maintains numerous households for his concubines and his wives, and he has numerous families of children, but those families never really interact very much, perhaps. So he wants his half-sister, and yet, of course, he's told later by the half-sister herself, when he tries to rape her, why don't you just ask the king and he'll give you to me? I can marry you. Because apparently half-sisters and half-brothers could marry in those days, even though it is forbidden by the law of Moses. Yet there are some examples earlier on in the Bible. In fact, there's one verse that suggests that Abraham and Sarah were half-brother and half-sister. Well, he doesn't want to marry her, though, and as soon as he's raped her, as soon as he's had his wicked way with her, he throws her out of the house. She becomes odious to him. So Amnon is a person of powerful passions and lusts, which could go either way. He's not to be trusted. One moment he wants it, and the other moment the exact thing he once wanted is now disgusting to him. He hates it. The other thing is, because Amnon was then seized with extreme hatred for her, the hatred he now felt for her was greater than his earlier love. Well, what sort of person is Amnon? A weak person, a stupid person, a man of his passions, a man of conflicting passions, not really worthy of the title man at all, a weak, awful person. And yet this awful person has no difficulty in persuading his servants to do exactly what he wants. The rape is set up by the servants. They leave the room, you know. Oh, hang on. None of them, it doesn't occur to any of them, or maybe it does occur to them, but, you know, they know that their role is to facilitate the desires of the king's son. And another person who facilitates the king's son's desires is his cousin Jonadab, the brother of the son of David's brother, who says, look, you know, you're always mooning after this girl. Well, why don't you have her? This is how you do it. You pretend to be ill, call the king will come, and then you say to the king, send my sister over. I want something from her, cooked by her, and that'll make me better. And of course, in other words, Amnon, that doesn't surprise anybody because Amnon is somebody who is whimsical. Oh, I feel ill. Oh, I've got this pain. Oh no, come and kiss it better. Oh well, I tell you what, if my half sister makes one of her cakes, I'll feel a lot better then. Oh, I've got to have my half sister making a cake. He's a spoiled child. And how do you become a spoiled child? You have people who spoil you. So he's a victim of his circumstances. He's got King David as his father. He's got all these servants around him. He's spoilt, rotten. He's thick as well. He hasn't thought this through because after all, after you've raped your half-sister, what are you going to do then? That's why she says to him, for goodness sake, don't disgrace yourself. Don't disgrace me. She tries to reason with him, but he's beyond reason. And of course, after Amnon is dead, nobody ever mentions his name again. Nobody says, oh my goodness, Prince Amnon is dead. What a disaster that was for the dynasty. No, nobody regrets him. Prince Amnon, he's not a prince, actually. The concept of the idea of the prince isn't one that is around at this time. But Amnon does remind you, does he not, of members of other royal families who've disgraced themselves over the years. I'm thinking of at least two princes in the contemporary world who have brought disgrace upon themselves. One who's been sidelined, one who's a reigning prince who hasn't been sidelined, and indeed one who's a dethroned prince. I can think of several, actually. Is Amnon possibly the way to see Amnon as un señorito, a playboy, a spoilt brat? And of course, whereas King David grew up in a rather tough household and toughened himself up through wars, this boy has been born in luxury, lived in luxury, spoilt rotten from birth. King David is a bad father. That, with regard to Amnon, the fact he doesn't care about Amnon very much is also a sign that he's a bad father. And of course, the other person who gets no sympathy at all because she just disappears from the story, presumably her life is now ruined and she just disappears. Maybe she goes mad. We don't know. One of the people writing about this, I think, Michael Arditi, does say that she goes mad, but I'm not sure if she does. But nobody cares about her. She's, oh God, oh yeah, she was raped by her brother, wasn't she? Oh, what happened to her? Don't know. She just fades out of the story. No sympathy whatsoever. One of the things about King David's court is how nobody seems to have any sympathy for anybody else. There's no human feeling there. It's a piranha pool. Anyway, so King David was very angry, but he had no wish to harm his son Amnon. This is verse 22, whom he loved because he was his firstborn. Well, he seems to love Amnon. Absalom, however, would not so much as speak to Amnon, since he hated Amnon for having raped his sister Tamar. Now, King David, therefore, does nothing about the rape of his own daughter by one of his sons. That is a dereliction of fatherly duty and of kingly duty. The king is supposed to dispense justice. And then what happens is Absalom, has this party, invites all the king's sons. He gets his servants to kill Amnon when Amnon is drunk. So Amnon's a bit of a fool to go to this party. After all, they haven't been speaking for 2 years. Absalom waits for 2 years, where presumably his hatred of Amnon is such. But again, Absalom doesn't think this through, because after he's killed his elder brother, what's he going to do then? As it turns out, he flees to his grandfather's kingdom of Geshur. His mother, Maacah, was the daughter of the king of Geshur, so he just goes back to his grandfather's. He's got somewhere to go, and there he lives for 3 years, and he gradually tries to negotiate his return through his cousin, the king's commander of the king's army, Joab. And Joab eventually gets Absalom to come back. Joab stages this intrigue, this is in chapter 14, which allows Absalom to come back. But King David's a very bad father. He should never have allowed Absalom to come back. He should probably have had Absalom, well, he didn't have to have Absalom executed, but he could at least have let things ride. Absalom was in exile, and therefore that was punishment enough, and need never see him again. Right, so the sword will never be absent from your house. Obviously, Nathan the prophet sees this as, and the writer of the throne succession narrative sees this as God's vengeance for the sin of King David, the murder of Uriah. But in fact, it's also got wonderful psychological explanations. If you are an arriviste, as King David is, somebody who's arrived, had a tough childhood, but he's now arrived, he's now living in luxury, you spoil your children. He spoiled his children, and they act like spoiled children, because Amnon has done something bad. Absalom has also done something bad in getting vengeance and running away and then coming back. And David does something bad in allowing Absalom back, and nobody cares a sausage about poor Tamar. This is a severely dysfunctional family. All the best. We'll talk about them later. Bye.